It began not with a bang, nor a whisper, but with the quiet rustle of lace bunting in the trees, the soft tuning of a string quartet, and the kind of sunshine that made even the buttercups lift their heads a little higher. On most days, the hillside garden behind the Briarwood Inn was just that, a garden. Daisies nodded along the picket fence, bees made their unhurried rounds, and the cobblestone path wore its moss in dignified silence. But this day, it was anything but ordinary. The daisies had been coiffed. The chairs were dressed finer than most of the guests, and the inn's heirloom roses shrunk down by years, but no less proud leaned toward the congregation like they too wanted a front row seat, because a wedding was about to begin. Emma and Daniel, childhood best friends who once traded crayons in year 2 and swore, with sticky fingers and toothy grins, they'd get married one day. 15 years passed. They did just that. The guests arrived in flutters. Smatterings of laughter drifted over. The hydrangeas. A clumsy uncle misjudged the dimensions of the lemonade pitcher, and someone's gran mistook the string quartet for a Bluetooth speaker needing feedback. But even the mishaps felt part of the charm, because everyone could feel it this day had a kind of magic stitched quietly into its hem. And somewhere, just beyond the hedgerow, another guest prepared to arrive, one with no invitation, no RSVP, and no respect for seat assignments, but will get to him. The ceremony began precisely at 2. Daniel stood with nervous shoulders, repeatedly checking he hadn't lost the ring, while Emma, heart hammering, floated down the aisle on a ripple of whispers and camera clicks. She wore her mother's necklace. He wore socks his best man warned clashed terribly with the boutonniere, and yet, in that moment, everything was exactly right. They held hands at the altar of garden roses and wooden archways, the minister just beginning to speak the words that had summoned them from different chapters of life into one story when it happened. A flurry of feathers, a sudden, deliberate coo, and then, yes, truly a pigeon, not skimming the treetops or loitering near the breadcrumbs, as pigeons are wont to do. No, this one flew with purpose, bold and unbothered, as though summoned by love itself. It looped, once above the crowd eliciting gasps, below then spiraled down like a cotton ball with wings. A gracious descent, a dramatic pause, and then, without the faintest hesitation, it landed squarely on the bride's shoulder. There was a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a laugh, but something in between. A ripple of ohs and hus, and one very concerned flower girl who asked if the bird was part of the show. Emma froze. Daniel blinked. The officiant glanced up from his solemn binder, unsure if this counted as an omen or an opportunity. But Emma didn't shriek. She didn't flinch. After an initial breathless second, she looked sideways and laughed, because there it was, calm as a dandelion in bloom, a pigeon, round and confident, standing neatly on lace and tulle, blinking at the crowd like it too had something to say. Well, Emma said, turning cheek to feather, we did say we were open to surprises. A spray of laughter, relief, clapping. Someone in the second row whispered, wait, is that trained? Did they hire it? But her partner shook his head. Not on the invite. Photos were snapped. The quartet faltered, then continued, as if the bird's entrance had been belated choreography. Someone near the back gave it a name under their breath they'd later claim. Maxwell, maybe, or Percy. No one would agree, but all would remember. Because here's the thing about stories like this. They creep softly past your expectations. You think you're attending a wedding. You think it will be all cake and speeches. napkins folded into improbable swans. You do not expect, in the height of June, on the best day of someone else's life, to be sharing your seat with a pigeon. And liking it, it stayed, of course. At least for the rest of the ceremony, perched without pecking, still but alert, present and so unusually poised that by the time the minister pronounced them husband and wife, several guests had taken its presence, if not as gospel, then certainly as destiny. The pigeon's arrival altered something that day, not the timeline of events, not the speeches or supper, but something less visible, something that pulled a chuckle from the sternest father-in-law and softened the frown of the caterer, still panicking about missing cutlery. It left people wondering, why here? Why now? Why this wedding? And most of all, what makes a pigeon crash? A wedding, stay for the cake, and in time become a legend. They didn't know then. No one did. Not the couple who held each other with trembling hands. Not the guests who toasted with fizzy wine while glancing at the bird beside the cake table. Not even the innkeeper who, later, would find herself saving breadcrumbs just in case he came back. But they would know, eventually everyone would remember the day of lace bunting, garden vows, and a bird who defied logic, invitation lists, and gravity, and made people believe that, just maybe, love had feathers. The first thing anyone remembered was the sound, not the minister's gentle intoning or the stir of leaves overhead, but a rolling culo and surprisingly well-timed that cut cleanly through the final line of vows. It held for a second, musical but unmistakably assertive, as though weighing in with its own blessing, or editorial comment. Eyes turned upward in a ripple, heads craned, even the cellist paused mid-bow, and then they saw it, banking sharply from behind the arbor, wings stretched and sunlight skimming each smoky feather. It flew like it owned the sky, not in the erratic, uncertain patterns of most birds, not even in the gliding elegance of a dove, but with something close to discernment. A pause, a dip, a final flare, and then it landed. Not delicately, not incidentally, it landed with full ceremony on the left shoulder of Emma, the bride. Just as the rings were about to be exchanged, there was a collective intake of breath, a bouquet of gasps, and a couple muffled laughs. Somewhere, a groomsman stifled a snort behind his boot. The quartet stopped playing again. Emma didn't move. Neither did the pigeon. It stood, rather stately, on layers of imported tulle and hand-bedded lace, turning slightly to consider the crowd, chest puffed and bright-eyed as if awaiting its cue. Daniel, to his credit, recovered quickly. He began, adjusting his tie. "Does this count as a second witness?" A ripple of relieved laughter broke across the gathering. Even the minister let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I suppose we continue," he offered, his voice tilting into amused formality. Emma smiled, frozen at first, but then broke into a small laugh that caught in her bouquet. "We did say the wedding was open air," she said, "and open to surprises." The pigeon gave a single, dignified coo, and with that, the ceremony resumed. The ring was slipped onto her finger. Vows were exchanged. The flower girl recovered and sat quietly with her shoes kicked off. The pigeon remained in place, preening once or twice, presumably to look its best for the occasion. By the time the newlyweds were pronounced husband and wife, no one was talking about the reading from Corinthians or the solemnity of the knot tied. They were whispering about the bird. Whose was it? Had the venue trained it? Some kind of theatrical embellishment? A cousin with a flair for animal theatrics? "Nope," the wedding planner firmly said when asked. That bird is not Tandai. Repeat, not in any of my spreadsheets. The guests poured out into the garden for lemonade, prosecco, and confetti. The couple walked hand in hand down the cobblestone aisle while petals rained gently like blessings, and the pigeon, still present, not on Emma's shoulder anymore, though she swore she gave it a small parting pat. It had relocated itself with effortless dignity to the cake table, where it now perched beside a gossamer peony decoration like it had purchased the seating upgrade. The junior bridesmaid, Daisy, aged 10, going on 45, leaned over to examine it more closely. "It's not even scared," she murmured. "I think it winked at me," replied her little brother, awestruck and sugared. Dash Up the photographer tried just once to shoo the bird away from the corner of the frosting. It simply sidestepped, rearranged its tail feathers, and settled back down with what could only be described as purpose from then on. It was simply accepted. The pigeon was staying. The canapes came out on silver trays. Conversations buzzed. A toast was made, and still it lingered, hovering near enough to be noticed, far enough to not quite get in the way. When the first dance happened, it stood close to the edge of the floor watching, head slightly tilted, as if critiquing form and chemistry. When the children played games by the gazebo, it joined them, hopping gently among bubbles and chalk. Drawings somehow never quite ruffled. Rumors ran faster than the buffet line. Someone said it was enchanted. Someone else whispered that pigeons are messengers. After Ireland, who's to say love doesn't send them to the bride's cousin, a self-professed expert in bird behavior because she followed 4 nature accounts on Instagram, declared with authority, definitely hand-reared. You can tell by how it's not afraid of shoes. But none of it put a dent in the bird's serenity. It remained a calm presence among the laughter, the dancing, the clinking of glasses, and, miraculously, by all accounts and many vigilant glances, never once did it do what any self-respecting bird would have done within terrorizing proximity of white furniture and $1,000 cake tier. It didn't poop, not once. Emma herself, halfway through her bride's speech, motioned toward the bird with her champagne flute to Harold. She said suddenly. The crowd paused. She laughed, a little sheepishly. "Look, I'm naming him. If you can photobomb an entire ceremony and still come off more graceful than me mid-tears, you deserve a name. Harold it is." Murmurs of agreement passed through the tables. Someone held up a glass. To Harold, came the chorus. Harold, for his part, bobbed once in acknowledgement or hunger. It was hard to tell, but from that moment, the name stuck. People posed for photos with him, making little finger hearts and flirtatious smiles. A teen cousin tried teaching him how to dab. Most remarkably, a groomsman tried feeding him cake and was gently pecked away, as if Harold had dietary principles to uphold. He accepted crumbs from the flower girl, though only from her. Even the DJ called in late to handle the reception playlists, potted the commotion and nodded. "I've played for weddings with donkeys," he declared, "but this is a first." As evening settled, the fairy lights began to blink above the trellises. The garden wore its glow like an old love letter. Laughter rolled across the hillsides, and guests settled in their chairs, heads tilted toward the twilight and the soft second glass of cider, and beside the cake table, still seated nearly where he had landed hours ago, Harold closed one eye, then the other. Content, present. He hadn't spoken vows, but he had, in his feathery way, made a kind of quiet commitment, and what no one knew, not yet, was that this wasn't Harold's first wedding, nor would it be his last. After most of the guests had had their fill of cider and sentiment, the formal photos began. It started, as most wedding photo sessions do, with a reluctant herding of relatives, aunties searching for lip balm, groomsmen adjusting ties they had sworn were fine, children bribed with sweets to stand still for just one more. The photographer, a wiry man named Oliver with laugh lines and 2 camera bodies around his neck, was in his element, ducking and clicking and calling out, "Beautiful, gorgeous. Okay, now one with just the siblings, no blinking, and Harold." Harold. The pigeon remained part of the general background hum of the party, until Oliver, who had thus far regarded the bird as charming, but ultimately irrelevant, noticed something strange. In nearly every frame he had taken since the ceremony, Harold appeared not front and center, but present. Subtly, strangely present, hovering near the bride's heels, peeking from under a rosebush, reflected once in the polished glass of a window pane behind the GROOMSMEN. So when it came time for the official Emma and Daniel newlywed portrait, it wasn't entirely shocking, though still unexpected, when Harold toddled calmly into frame, stopped exactly between them, and struck a pose. Not a bird pose, not a flap or a hop. No, Harold stood with chest forward, feet parallel, and his beak angled poetically upward, like any seasoned artist aware of their profile. Oliver blinked behind his lens. "Well," he murmured, "he's hired." The shutter clicked. They took another and another, and every time the couple adjusted, their shoulders turned, their stance subtly shifted. Harold moved to dot like he belonged. Someone made a joke about honorary grooms. Then someone else suggested perhaps he was some kind of pigeon-bestowed marital blessing. Regardless, he was suddenly in high demand. By the time they got to the entire extended family, photoa, minor logistical miracle involving chairs, height order sorting, and one particularly opinionated grandfather, Harold had flapped neatly to the very front, positioning himself beside the flower girl as though she were his +1. She whispered something to him. He remained still. 2 photos later, someone shouted, "Can we get one just of Harold?" Oliver laughed, but he took it, and thus began the era of deliberate inclusion. For every shot taken in the hour that followed, there was one without Harold, and then inevitably another with him. Harold beside the bouquet toss. Harold perched contemplatively beside the wishing well. Harold sitting on the groom's discarded jacket like a bird-shaped paperweight of nuptial approval, when the best man tried to shoo him to steal the spotlight. Back, Harold simply sidled sideways 3 paces and stared off into middle distance, looking, somehow, deeply thoughtful. "He poses better than my last 2 Tinder dates," someone muttered. That quote made it to Twitter before the cake cutting. Even Oliver was charmed. He began trying to find new angles to shoot Harold, soft background blur behind the bouquet, silhouette against the trellis, candid alongside shoe prints in garden. Mud, he couldn't help it. The bird had presence, as the daylight softened into golden hour. Emma looked at one of the photo previews on Oliver's screenshot, where she and Daniel smiled toward each other under the ivy arch, and Harold stood between them, head tilted slightly. "I don't know," she said, puzzling over it. "He just looks like he belongs." Daniel came up behind her, peering at the screen too. "Maybe he does." That's when Emma leaned over unexpectedly to Harold and said, "You've earned your keep, Harold," and bent forward so Oliver could take one last candid bridegroom and Pigeon by this point Nearly every guest had taken at least one picture with him. Aunt Margaret did a stately seated pose. The college friends made duck lips and peace signs. The ring-bearer tried unsuccessfully to get Harold to perch. On his head, Daisy, the flower girl, had a Polaroid instant pic of the two of them taped into the guest book under the caption, "Me and my date." And the bird, inexplicably, complied with all of it. He sat on arms, shoulders, the occasional hat. Never flapped, never scratched. If someone got too close, he stepped away politely. But with children, it was different. The youngest guests clustered to him like ducklings to a feathered elder. One boy swore Harold whispered to him. No one believed it except a girl named Myra, age 7, who nodded solemnly. He told me he likes elderflower cordial. Even the skepticism faded by nightfall. The truth was, by the time the sun slipped behind the hill and the stars began to dust the velvet of the sky, no one quite knew what the wedding would have been like without Harold. Someone asked the bride if she'd mind if the florist brought out the extra boutonniere and pinned it gently to a sash for Harold. Emma shrugged and smiled. He's more charming than most members of both our families. Let him have a flower, so he did. A tiny blush rose, nestled tenderly inside a cotton ribbon that Dylan, the groomsman with the best handwriting, slipped around Harold's neck with respectful ceremony. And somehow, Harold wore that miniature boutonniere with the same dignity he had worn the bride's veil just hours before. "I'm telling you," said Uncle Dave, sipping his third cider. "This pigeon's gonna be famous. Mark my words." The famous part would come, of course. But that evening, Harold just sat amid the twinkling glasses and swaying fairy lights, where laughter curled around him like smoke and plates clinked with the soft rituals of celebration. Every so often, he blinked, or turned his head, or fluffed one quiet wing, a pigeon, uninvited, unnamed until hours earlier, and yet somehow the first name on everyone's lips, and the one guest who utterly, unintentionally, stole a little piece of everyone's heart. If you asked the innkeeper, not during check-in rush, mind you, but once she'd set down her evening tea, she'd tell you that Harold didn't just attend the wedding, he stayed. Not in the way you might imagine. He didn't waddle up to a birdhouse and start renting rooms. No. But the day after the wedding, she found him nestled atop the wrought iron lantern by the trellised entrance, watching guests check out like some kind of feathery concierge. "Harold?" she asked aloud, setting out a shallow dish of water beside some biscuit crumbs. He blinked once. That afternoon, a housekeeper caught him perched under the fairy lights. The next morning, he was seen calmly inspecting the herb garden, as if vetting its culinary contributions. And from then on, Harold became a permanent fixture, at least, as permanent as any bird could be. He came and went, of course. Pigeons always do, but never too far, and never for long. Locals began to take note. A snapshot of Harold atop the floral arch made its way to the Briarwood Inn's social media page, captioned simply, "Our most photogenic guest yet." It garnered more likes than their Valentine's prix menu, a fact that mildly irritated the kitchen staff until the photo was picked up by a regional lifestyle blog, then by a wedding-themed Instagram account. By Thursday, Reddit had a thread titled, "Uninvited Pigeon Becomes Star at Intimate Garden Wedding." By Saturday, someone photoshopped him into a tuxedo. By Monday, BuzzFeed had weighed in with a light-hearted listicle, 13 times a bird was a better guest than your ex. The inn's receptionist, Lucy, began receiving calls with the same question. "Is the pigeon still there?" Strangers dropped by with camera phones, and crusts from artisan bread loaves. One young couple asked if they could propose in Harold's presence for luck. A groom-to-be wrote a blog post where he called Harold the kind of confidant I hope to be on my wedding day. Harold, for his part, tolerated the attention with his usual mild detachment. He posed obligingly for selfies when it suited him. He'd land on the corner of a stroller, the edge of a picnic bench, but never lingered with anyone too long. Except for one little girl named Polly, who insisted Harold recognized her from somewhere. No one corrected her. Soon, the town had adopted him as unofficial mascot. Someone crocheted him a miniature scarf. A fashion accessory, not functional, they said. The baker across the road tried making pigeon-shaped cookies, but had modest success, citing Harold's incredibly particular bone structure. The florist began pinning small honorary corsages to the window ledge, just in case he feels underdressed today. And still he came. Not every day, but often enough. The innkeeper admitted she'd started saving leftover granola. The groundskeeper claimed he only arrived on days when the air felt like spring. The minister confessed, quietly, that the aisle where Harold had landed was now her favorite place to officiate. Then came the interviews. First, a local morning show requested Emma and Daniel to come on air, fresh from their honeymoon. Then a more polished media outlet called, "We loved your wedding story. Is it true?" The pigeon bowed during the speeches. Daniel glanced at Emma. Well, nodded, maybe, or had indigestion. But yes, Emma smiled. He was very well behaved for someone who didn't RSVP. Once, a production assistant asked if they'd be comfortable introducing Harold on camera. Emma, half joking, replied, "Only if he's free that day." And so Harold's legend grew not with spectacle, but with remarkable consistency. He showed up at the farmer's market one Saturday, perched on the general store's sign as though greeting commuters. He visited the town square the afternoon of an engagement photo. Neither the couple nor the photographer had asked for his services, but later, their favorite shot featured him blinking curiously near a pair of intertwined shoes. Even skeptics softened an older gentleman who famously scowled a tourist. Birds confessed. Harold reminded him of his late wife's fondness for spontaneous beauty. A teacher from the local school invited him to a Year 3 classroom visit. Educational purposes, she claimed. One evening, as dusk sprinkled lavender across the sky, the inn erected a small wooden plaque where Harold had first landed during the ceremony. Just below the rose trellis, simple engraving, "In fondness and feathers, June 12th. Visitors began leaving tiny notes beneath it, folded scraps of paper, postcards, even the occasional button, pebble, or ribbon. Wishes, mostly. Hopes scribbled in apology or ink or glitter pen. I want to fall in love like Harold, calmly, unexpectedly. My nana says pigeons are good at finding their way home. Please help me find mine." And, once, in looping cursive, "Thank you for showing up. We needed it more than you know." It was only a matter of time before the curiosity turned into investigation. By the second week after the wedding, when Harold had been spotted perched on a railing near the ice cream cart, politely declining strawberry cone drips while the town's teenagers giggled behind plastic spoons, someone asked what everyone had been thinking. Where did he come from? The theories had drifted like petals across the summer winds. A runaway pet, a professionally trained animal who lost his way, a spirit animal, a sign, a reincarnated great uncle, whispered one particularly superstitious aunt. Come to see Daniel finally behave like a proper gentleman. But behind the clamor of laughter and poetic speculation, someone decided to find out the truth. That someone was Dr. Neera Saunders, the local veterinarian. She had only met Harold in passing that first week when he showed up at her clinics. Windowsill and gazed at the waiting room goldfish with what she could only describe as polite restraint. He'd left shortly after, trailing a single feather and an almond crumble he'd stolen from her lunch. Intrigued and a little enchanted, she kept a pocketful of sunflower seeds. Eventually, he came close enough to be scanned. The band was barely visible under Harold's slate-grey foot feathers, worn smooth by weather and time. But it was their tiny metal loop, stamped with a string of symbols and numbers. When she ran it through the National Pigeon Racing Registry, the match came quickly. Harold had a registered name, HRD 738Q, male, hatched spring, 4 years ago, once albeit briefly a racing pigeon. Next to the listing was a phone number and an address. Just outside the nearest city, Dr. Saunders made the call. An older man answered on the third ring, his voice the audio equivalent of wool tweed, gentle but reserved. "Yes," he said after she'd finished explaining. "That's one of mine. Used to be, anyway." His name was Malcolm Harrow, retired electrician, amateur pigeon racer. He agreed to come the next day. He arrived with a cap in his hands and a biscuit tin under his arm. They met in the garden behind the clinic. Harold took one look, gave a coo that sounded remarkably like an indignant sniff, and turned his back. Malcolm chuckled, still holding a grudge. "Are we?" Dr. Saunders raised an eyebrow. "Did something happen?" Malcolm lowered himself onto the garden bench with a sigh that carried both age and affection. He was always a little particular. According to Malcolm, Harold had been one of 6 pigeons he'd trained in a makeshift coop beside his greenhouse. Most of them were average flyers. 1 or 2 had promise. But Harold, unpredictable flight paths, Malcolm recounted, would leave the starting basket straight as an arrow, then take a detour over half the county, but always came back. He won 3 local club races not because he was the fastest, but because he flew cleverly, took odd shortcuts no one understood. He once beat 30 pigeons simply by flying under a storm and landing dry, fluffing out his chest like he'd just solved a crossword puzzle. He had flair, Malcolm said simply. Style, a sort of creative disregard for convention. When Harold disappeared, Malcolm hadn't been entirely surprised. He was restless. The others were content, just circling back. But Harold, he shrugged. "I got the feeling he was looking for something else." Dr. Saunders sat quietly, letting the words settle. "I thought maybe a hawk got him," Malcolm added. "Or maybe he just picked a new coop." Then he smiled, watching Harold pick carefully at a piece of shortbread. Someone had left on the bench rail. Looked like he picked a wedding instead. They didn't talk for long after that. Malcolm left the biscuit tin empty, save for a note. "You always were too curious for your own good, old friend." Before leaving, he turned to Harold and said, not without a touch of pride, "Well, you found your audience." After Malcolm's visit, the story spread again, this time with roots. Harold, the pigeon with a past, the racing retiree turned sudden celebrity. Once a flyer of loops and impossible arches, now a crasher of nuptials and bearer of quiet blessings. People liked the new chapter, even more than the mystery. Children told the tale with mystic voices, casting Harold as a wanderer guided by the scent of roses and vows. Adults, perhaps more quietly, wondered at what it meant to leave what's known in search of something undefined but beautiful. As always, Harold refused commentary. He spent the week after Malcolm's visit, napping in the rhododendrons and letting the flower girl parley, by name and temperament, tell him about her plans to one day become a bird. Occasionally, he would fly off for a day or two, to where no one knew, but he always returned in his own time. Dr. Saunders began keeping a small log in her office, observed Harold today, ate half a blueberry muffin, watched traffic, got startled by wind chimes, refused seeds from stranger, allowed schoolboy to sketch him. She wasn't sure why she kept it, only that it felt important to mark the passage of a life that seemed somehow to understand things most didn't. Or maybe he just understood weddings, not the taffeta and the programs, but the feeling, the moment when two people stood up and, with trembling hands, said, "We choose each other. In this world, today, exactly as we are." She wondered if maybe Harold had once seen such a moment, not at Briarwood, not at the wedding he'd joined, but somewhere long before, and perhaps he just wanted to see it again. It began quietly, like most things worth remembering. A photo shoot just outside a vineyard, blue sky, drifting clouds. A newly engaged couple standing awkwardly at the golden hour edge of a wildflower field, the smell of lavender and old wine, barrels in the air. The photographer called for a candid laugh, look at each other like no one's watching, and then paused mid-frame. She said, squinting through her viewfinder. "Did you hire a bird?" There he was, Harold.com as ever, perched solemnly on a wooden wine crate, blinking into the lens like he had an equity stake in the album. The photo they kept, the one that made it onto their printed invitation. Harold right in the corner, head tilted, as though pondering the weight of forever by the time spring rolled into summer. Harold had appeared at 3 more weddings, always uninvited, always arriving at moments that made people pause. He was never disruptive, never early, always with precision. One bride swore he landed exactly when her father took her hand. Another said he didn't appear until the first kiss, like a feathered stamp of approval. And not once did anyone spot how or from where he came. One moment he wasn't there, the next he was. The ripple of stories formed quickly, then collected into a tide. Waves of Harold-inspired traditions bubbled up around the region. A florist began placing a single unclaimed bloom on each wedding table, in case Harold joins us. A baker, amused by the stories, crafted pigeon-shaped cake toppers with crowns of sugar ivy. A bridesmaid in turquoise flats started a Facebook page called Waiting for Harold. She had no real expectation he'd appear at her sister's wedding. But he did. He flew in at the reception, brazzing over silk napkins and orchestral strings, landing gracefully on the corner of the welcome sign. She took a photo, posted it, #hashtag Wedding Harold. Within 2 weeks, 8,000 people followed the page. By the time pumpkins lined porches and leaves burned russet along garden paths, it had 78,000 followers. The posts came in from everywhere. I left a little seed cone at my ceremony just in case. Didn't see Harold, but 2 pigeons landed near our vows, maybe apprentices. I swear he looked right at me when I was having second thoughts. That moment changed everything. Dr. Saunders, still keeping her Harold log, read the entries. Quietly at night, one man wrote, "We eloped alone on a hill upstate. Just us and a coronet of trees. No guests, no family. At the exact moment we said I do, a pigeon landed on my shoulder. Swear on my life. Could have choked and cried at the same time. A local columnist dubbed Harold a romantic without borders. A podcast titled Feathers and Fate released an episode called The Bird Who Believed in Marriage. The host jokingly hoped Harold would RSVP to her future wedding, but only if it's real love certified. And all the while Harold remained unmoved by the fame. He still visited the inn now and again, but less frequently. He favored gardens over fanfare. On market mornings, he was sometimes spotted near the cheese stall, politely inspecting brie samples. In the evenings, he'd appear on a lamppost near the bus stop, watching people go home to their small dinners and late-night reruns. Around Valentine's Day, a letter arrived at the Briarwood Inn, addressed simply to Harold the Pigeon. Inside was a photo. Taped to the back was a message. "Thank you, Harold. You gave me the courage to ask." Stories like these kept coming. A teenager confided she broke off an engagement that didn't feel right after Harold flew by and landed at her grandmother's feet. She said he was reminding her what trust should look like. An elderly couple, renewing their vows, joked that their original wedding didn't have Harold, but we might have lasted 8 years shorter if it had. Then spring arrived. The air changed softer, dusted with hope. The crocuses trembled up through the earth, and brides and grooms lined up outside registry offices like daffodils. People waited, hoped, shared rumors, but Harold didn't come. Weddings passed unnoticed. Couples confessed quiet disappointment. "Not that I believe in luck," one groom muttered, "but I had this idea in my head." The florist removed her extra boutonniere one weekend after it wilted in place. The baker stopped, making pigeon cookies after 3 unsold batches. Even the innkeeper fussing still overrose. Trellis repairs scanned the sky with less expectation. Dr. Saunders made a final notation in her log. March 2nd, empty skies, no sign, missing feathers and mystery. For a town that had not asked for a legend, they became quietly attached to one, and every story that ended in silence felt a little like walking into a familiar room and finding the furniture rearranged. Nothing broken, just different. And then just before anyone could say the name Harold without a beat of regrets, something happened. It started quietly, the morning of June 12th. The Thursday dawned like any other at the Briarwood Inn. Dew pearl dotted the lawn, and a chorus of robins rehearsed under blue skies. The innkeeper, Maureen, was preparing to mow. The smell of petrol lingered. She moved to pull the starter cord when something made her pause. Not a sound exactly, not a movement, just the feeling that she was not alone. She turned her head, and there he was, perched with impossible poise on the edge of the garden, swing beneath the arbor, the exact place he had landed a year ago. Harold, he didn't coo, didn't strut or flutter, or demand anything at all. He simply was. Maureen blinked twice, half convinced it was a trick of light or memory. But when she stepped forward, he tilted, his head slowly a nod. An acknowledgement she couldn't explain why her throat caught the way it did, or why her first instinct wasn't to speak, but to sit, so she did. Lowered herself carefully onto the cold flagstone near the swing and folded her hands in her lap. "Well now," she said after a few beats, "you know what today is." Harold remained still. She glanced at her watch. 2:04 p.m., almost exactly the hour the wedding started last year. A breeze tousled the wisteria. Somewhere inside, the kettle rang. For a moment, Maureen sat in silence with a pigeon who did not blink. Then Quite suddenly, she stood again and disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, it was with a small plate of shortbread and a saucer of milk. She didn't know if pigeons drank milk. Probably not, but it felt right. She placed them beside the swing, as if hosting an old friend. Harold hopped down, not rushed, not even hungry from the look of it, merely polite. He took one crumb, then another, then stopped. Together, they watched the breeze lift the edge of a wind chime. At 2:23, a car drove past the gravel road below. At 2:29, Maureen's phone vibrated with an unread recipe notification. She ignored both. A couple visiting from the city passed by the garden gate on their walk, pausing when they saw the bird. The woman whispered, "Is that?" Her husband nodded mutely. They gently backed away, reverent. No one else interrupted, not until 3:01, when Harold stood abruptly, wings flexed, and took flight. Not a struggle, not a performance, just a single elegant arc up over the arbor, past the sycamore, and out beyond the inn's roofline, it clean and perfect. Maureen stood, brushing earth from her skirt, and whispered, "Thank you." The clip appeared online 8 hours later. The inn had hosted a small anniversary garden tea for Emma and Daniel, nothing grand. Just a few friends, leftover bunting, and a modest lemon sponge. The videographer, Daniel's cousin, Lewis, had taken a few shots for memory's sake, not expecting much in one angle. During Emma's thank you toast, the swing rocked gently behind her. The camera pans to follow a bird's gentle ascent into sky, cutting across sunlight in a gleam of grey and silver dot. No one noticed it in real time, but by morning, the comments were filling in. "That's him, it's Harold, he came back." On Reddit, a video compilation surfaced. Glimpses of Harold across weddings, gardens, bunting-strung receptions. They set it to music. Soft piano. The last frame lingered on the inscription beneath the rose trellis, now garlanded in petals and tiny wishes, which someone had dusted off for the occasion. In fondness and feathers. June 12th. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing crashed, no. Songs were written, no monuments built. But something changed. Couples began visiting the inn not to chase nostalgia. Exactly, but something gentler. They left letters in small calligraphied envelopes addressed to the sky postman. They tucked flowers into the arbor swing. Just one. Always white. Someone slipped a ring beneath the plaque, tied to a ribbon, with a note saying, "Here's 2 circles." Closed and continuing. The innkeeper, without making a show of it, put up a little wooden perch on an old iron rod between the rose trellis and the guestbook bench. It wasn't marked. No plaque, no fanfare, just a perch. Within days, the first note arrived, folded inside a packet of birdseed, in handwriting careful but smudged. "I don't know what you saw in us, but I'm grateful you saw it." Another followed, and another. They called it Harold's Perch. Not officially, not on any map, but that's what people called it. Emma stopped by a few weeks later with a ribbon clipped from her bouquet, a year old, bleached softly by sunlight, and tied it around. The post. Daniel took her hand. They stood in silence for a long while, and above them, wind-brushed petals from the tree limbs, one by one, like seconds rediscovered. Nobody ever quite knew if he would return again after that. Some said he had done what he came to do, others believed he was watching from somewhere else, waiting for the next moment that deserved a soft-winged witness. But for those who'd seen him, who'd felt the hush when he landed, and the quiet joy he left behind there was no forgetting. Some things land without warning, stay without asking, leave without goodbye, still manage to be exactly what we needed, and so the perch stayed. The notes came, and now and then, when the wind angled just right, someone swore they heard a sound, not quite a coo, not quite the flutter of feather, but something soft and finishing, like the punctuation of grace. There are stories that end with fireworks. Some find their close in sudden farewells or lingering embraces, but some just a few drift quietly to shore, like a feather on still water, asking nothing but to be remembered with kindness. Harold's story was one of those, not because it lacked wonder, not for absence of surprise, but because it settled somewhere deep and warm and curious, like a soft note played just once, but heard forever, for all the weddings he graced, for every moment. He landed without warning and left without fanfare. No one could say exactly why he chose them. Why these people? Why this town? There was never an answer, not the kind you could frame or fold into a newspaper headline. But perhaps love doesn't ask for explanation. It asks only for recognition. And Harold, feathered and mute, firm-footed in the details. Most of us overlooked, recognized something. Maybe it was in the way two hands clasped too tightly during a speech, or the silence that came before the vows, trembling with quiet courage. Maybe it was the nervous tilt of a boutonniere pinned by shaky fingers and held in place by hope. Or maybe, quite simply, it was laughter, the kind that tumbles out raw and real like joy, forgetting it's supposed to be polite. That kind of love, the kind a pigeon might fly toward if he knew what he was doing. Or even if he'd in single quotes. In the months that followed Harold's last visit, the town didn't pretend to be the same. Not every wedding was graced by his presence, of course. Nor did every garden flutter with the expectation of wings. But something had shifted. It was in the way chairs were arranged with one extra at the end, or how couples paused slightly longer beneath the arbor, as though listening for a sound they knew had once echoed there. Not for superstition's sake, but in quiet respect, because sometimes love isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It arrives like Harold did, uninvited, unbothered, and absolutely sure of its place. Over time, the perch outside the briarwood and collected so many notes. Maureen had to start keeping them in shoeboxes in the laundry closet. Each scribble a wish, a memory, an unanswered question folded tightly into birdseed wrappers and bits of ribbon. One simply read, "We tried again. Thank you." Another, "I didn't believe in anything until I believed he came for her." Once neatly printed and postmarked, from a foreign country came a letter burying these 5 words. Between stories of hesitation and hallelujah, he made us feel seen. And maybe that was the secret of it all. Harold didn't do anything extraordinary, really. He didn't sing, he didn't dance. He never delivered messages or brought rings tied in string. He simply showed up when no one asked him to. He arrived at edges, at moments undecided, a witness neither opinionated nor absent. He gave people pause, and in an age where so much asks us to rush to love louder, perform better, sparkle brighter, Harold reminded everyone that sometimes being present is the most generous act of all. No banner, no trumpet, no checklist reviewed twice, just wings folded beside a cake table, a head cocked during vows, an unreadable silence that still said, "I see you." Time passed, seasons turned over themselves like a well-worn bedspread, the unchanged menus, New vines climbed the walls. Children who once giggled into heralds. Feathers grew taller and quieter and maybe unsure whether it had all been real, but the memory won't fade. It's tucked too neatly into hearts, too sweetly into scrapbooks. It's whispered in the way a retired florist reclaims a single bloom each June. It lives in the corner of a photo frame where he happened to blink. And in that photo, when you look closely, Harold isn't front and center. He's where you'd least expect him, which of course is exactly where he knew to be. Sometimes wings or symbols, sometimes they're metaphors, and sometimes they just belong to a bird who knew what love looked like and chose to land in the middle of it, quietly, uninvited, and completely right on time.